ladies and gentlemen. The topic of today's class is Queen Victoria, and perhaps the question, was Victoria Victorian? What do I mean by Victorian? Of course, depends whether you support or oppose the Victorian values. We'll talk about Victorian values soon enough, in 2 weeks' time. So to make it very, very quick, for those who support the Victorian values, this was the age of prosperity and progress and modernity, and the Queen and her reign embodied all that. For those who oppose the Victorian values, this was the term associated with prudishness and excessive seriousness and sexual repression and all the nasty, hypocritical things that came to be a stereotype associated with Victoria, especially in her later age. We'll talk about it in a little moment. So was she Victorian? Let's find out. Last time we talked about British monarchy, we talked about the Regency period and the reigns of the so-called wicked uncles of Victoria, that is George IV and William IV. You may remember when George IV was still the Prince of Wales and the Prince Regent. His only daughter, Princess Charlotte, died unexpectedly as a result of childbirth complications. So all those younger brothers realized they had to marry legitimate German Protestant princesses and start producing legal children. One of those brothers was Edward, the Duke of Kent, who married the sister of the widower of Princess Charlotte, Prince Leopold. And also the sister of the Duke of Coburg. She was a widowed woman. She was a young widow with 2 children already, so it was known that she could have more children. Her name was Victoria. She usually used it in the French spelling, Victoire. And soon enough, the Duke and Duchess of Kent had a baby daughter who would later grow up to be Queen Victoria. There were some problems with the christening. This was still when George was the Prince Regent. Victoria was born in 1819, the 24th of May 1819, so you can do the maths. And when she was supposed to be christened, there was the question of what name to give her. The Duke and Duchess of Kent wanted to name her Elizabeth because she was close enough to the throne, and there wasn't a lot of hope that the elder brothers of the Duke would produce legitimate children who would, let's say, supersede Victoria in the run for the throne. The Prince Regent objected. He said, this is too obvious. Well, you cannot call this child Victoria. She's not a royal daughter. You cannot call her Elizabeth. She's not a royal daughter. The next proposal was let's call her Charlotte. Then, of course, the Prince Regent objected again. This was the name of his mother, but it was also the name of his dead daughter. So it was too painful. So finally, the Duke of Kent, Victoria's father, said, so what should we call her? And the Prince Regent answered, oh, whatever, give her her mother's name. So this is how Victoria became Victoria. This wasn't a popular name among the royals. It became very popular after Victoria came to the throne, but this was a completely new name in the royal family. She also had other names. The royals never have just one name. She had another name, Alexandrina. Actually, her first name was Alexandrina Victoria. She never really used it. When she was a toddler, some members of the family called her Drina for Alexandrina, but she never really used that. This was the name she got in honor of the Tsar of Russia, who was her nominal godfather. Of course, he didn't travel to the ceremony, but he sent representatives, and he was like a nominal godfather to Victoria. Then the first tragedy happened when Victoria was still a baby. She wasn't even 1 year old then. Her father, the Duke of Kent, caught a child and died. Just as simple as that. He went for a long walk, got wet in the rain, it developed into a bad case of pneumonia, he died unexpectedly. Being a fairly young, strong, athletic man with military experience, nobody expected that, and least of all his wife, the now Dowager Duchess of Kent. She, for a moment, she wanted to return to Germany because she knew the language. She didn't speak good English really, and she had most of her family there. But then her brother, Prince Leopold, intervened. He stayed in Britain. He promised he would support her. And he realized how important this little baby Victoria was. So he believed that she should be raised in Britain, and so it was. Victoria was raised in Kensington Palace, not really in royal conditions. She was a princess, but she wasn't spoiled by luxury in her early age. She remembered her childhood as rather frugal for a royal family, of course, and lonely. She didn't have any friends, and she didn't really have a very good relationship with her mother. I mentioned last time the person of John Conroy, her mother's personal secretary and closest companion. There were rumors that they were lovers. We will never know. Anyway, Victoria hated the man. He believed he was bad influence on her mother. There are all kinds of stories circulated about what exactly happened that made Victoria hate John Conroy so. Perhaps she caught him and her mother in flagrante. He was a married man, he had children as well, and these were some of very few children that Victoria was allowed to meet when she was a child herself. She didn't like them because she didn't like Conroy, so she didn't really have any friends. Or he tried to bully her to sign some documents, like the documents signed stating that if George IV and William IV died before Victoria's maturity, which could be understood in a different way. It could be 18 years old or even 25 years old. Then there would be another regency, and the Duchess of Kent would be the next regent. Victoria didn't want that. She wanted to be free of the influence of her mother as soon as possible. She was subjected to very, I would say, strict regime. She was never allowed to sleep alone in the room. She was never allowed to walk down the stairs without holding somebody's hand, just in case she slipped and broke her neck. She was such an important person for the royal family, and especially for the Duchess of Kent. Victoria called it the Kensington system. Early on, when she was a young teenager, I think 13, she started writing a diary, and she wrote the diary until the end of her life. Not all of the volumes of the diary survive, but as those that do give us the insight into the personal thoughts and emotions of the young princess and then the queen. Her closest companion, the person she was really most attached to at this time, was her governess, a German noblewoman, Baroness Leysen. She was like a mother figure to Victoria, much more than her own mother. The Duchess of Kent was not well liked by the royal family either, especially William IV disliked her, and even there were cases, very public cases, that he insulted her at the family dinner table. At one point he said, I guess it was his birthday or something, that Victoria and her mother were invited to a dinner party when William IV said that he really wished he would live long enough for Victoria to turn 18, because then there wouldn't be the regency. And he said expressly he wouldn't like this woman looking at the Duchess of Kent to ever have anything more to say politically. And he did. He kept his word. He actually died just 2 or 3 weeks after Victoria's 18th birthday. So she came to the throne as a very young woman, as a teenager. She didn't have any formal education. All she had was some private lessons from Baroness Leysen and some tutors that were hired to come to Kensington Palace to teach Victoria. She was quite gifted. She wasn't perhaps academically inclined, but she was quite artistically talented. She played music. She had a very good singing voice, apparently. She loved dancing. She loved drawing and painting watercolors. She had a sketchbook in which she sketched herself and people from her vicinity quite a lot. She was quite athletic. She loved horse riding. So she was a very lively person. She had a very lively personality. She was quite domineering. She could be quite quarrelsome if something did not suit her. So this young girl became the queen. The first thing she did was to have her own room, to have her own ways, and to distance herself from her mother and her court, including John Conroy. This man will return in a moment. So Victoria was very small. She was short. She was, some sources say she was like 1 meter 48 centimeters tall or thereabouts, and so she wasn't a very majestic looking person, but those who knew her usually remembered that she could make a presence in the room. She really commanded the attention. So despite her small stature, she was quite a visible presence. She had charisma. Later on, she started putting on weight. This was her problem throughout her life, really, but it exacerbated after those 9 pregnancies, and in later age she was quite large, even though she was still rather short. So she needed somebody to tell her what to do, to teach her to be a queen, and she found this person in her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. You may remember I told you about this lover of Lord Byron, Lady Caroline Lamb, the one who called him mad, bad and dangerous to know. Lord Melbourne was her long-suffering husband. By the time Victoria came to the throne, Lady Caroline was long dead, but Lord Melbourne was a kind of bon vivant, a kind of man with a lot of charisma himself. and they struck a note of sympathy almost immediately. He became her most trusted advisor, her like surrogate father to her. He really was the first important man in her life, mostly in this kind of paternal sense. He was a respected politician, the leader of the Whig Party, and he never treated Victoria as a child. From the very beginning, he spoke to her and addressed her like a grown-up, like a lady. Some say that he flirted with her and that she was perhaps even a little bit in love with him. We will never know. Anyway, there was a lot of respect, and we might even say personal friendship between these two. This had a lot of good sides, of course, because Lord Melbourne taught Victoria a lot about being the Queen and what she should do as a Queen, but it also had some negative sides, the greatest of which was the so-called bedchamber crisis. The bedchamber crisis was a political crisis in which the 19-year-old Victoria overthrew a government. Because the convention at the Royal Court in London was that after the general election, when the new political party was forming the government, the leader of this political party would of course become the new Prime Minister, but also most, if not almost all, of the ladies of the court would be replaced by the wives and daughters of the government party. So when Victoria came to the throne and the Whigs were in power with Lord Melbourne as their leader, the wives and daughters of Whig politicians had the nominations of being the ladies of the court in Victoria's court. And when the Whigs lost the next general election the next year, and Sir Robert Peel, the leader of the Conservative Party, was planning to form the government, he approached Victoria with the request to change some or the majority of her ladies from the Whig women. Of course, women were not politicians, but they were closely related to the politicians, to the Conservative women. And normally, any other monarch would, of course, agree. This was the way it was always done. But Victoria, being a spirited teenager, said, no way. These women are not politicians. They are my personal friends. I'm not going to replace any of them. Thank you very much. So Sir Robert Peel, being a rather shy man, unlike Lord Melbourne, just bowed and backed out of the room and said he was not able to form the government. So Lord Melbourne and the Whigs were back in power for more or less another year. Next time, when the government lost the election, the Whigs lost the election again, Lord Melbourne had a long talk with Victoria, persuading to her that this time she should really allow to replace some of her ladies, because this was the way that the political system functioned in Britain. But it really tells you a little bit about the personality and temperament of Victoria. She could be quite unruly. There was another crisis of the first years of her reign when she wrongly accused one of her mother's ladies, Lady Flora Hastings, of getting pregnant without being married. And to make things worse, she started to have this kind of swelling in her belly. Shortly after, she travelled with John Conroy alone in a couch. So, of course, Victoria put two and two together and openly accused Lady Flora of being immoral and getting pregnant with John Conroy. It looked like she might be right, but she wasn't. Poor Lady Flora just suffered from cancer, and there was a tumor growing in her belly, and within a few weeks she died. Victoria was very sorry, and she was really publicly shamed for this behavior. This was something that taught her perhaps to be a bit more cautious with her accusations, but it tells you something about her temperament as well. So the next question was, who should Victoria marry? Of course, when she came to the throne as a teenager, she said, I'm going to be like Elizabeth, I'm not going to marry anyone, I just want to enjoy my freedom. But both her family and the politicians, including Lord Melbourne, insisted that in order to finish the dynastic crisis, she should marry someone. Who should that be? We continue in a moment.